It's $10. Such to me, that was an easy way of getting around all this. Oh, yeah. All right. Good evening and welcome to the City Council Conference of Tuesday, April 22nd, 2025. One item on the agenda, a summary of the AIM Norman Land Use and Master Plans, along with scenario training. Amy, are you the lead on this?
I think I'm going to kick it off, yes.
All right. Missing.
Well, welcome. Thank you. It's great to be here. Pleasure to always to be back. So we're going to go through, for anybody who attended last, I was going to say month, but it's still the same month, the session a couple weeks ago with the Planning Commission. This will be ultimately what we want to get to tonight will be very similar to that Planning Commission meeting. So we're really excited to run through a couple of scenarios with you to show how the plan will be used in staff reports and what you will be seeing come before you. So we think that'll be a great tool for helping you kind of understand how the plan works, since it is a little bit different from the past. But we want to talk through a few things, just kind of set the table for everybody. There's a few things that we'll go over that you've probably heard us present a few other times, but we never think it never hurts to make sure we set the context. And there's a few questions that we also want to make sure we kind of address that have come up in the last couple weeks too. So again, just as a high-level overview of the engagement that we've had to date, we've had over 24,000 visits to the website. We had a number of events. We had 3,000 participants in the polling questions, and we also did a citywide mailer, which was one thing. We did that back, I think, in October of 2024. October and November of 2024. We want to just run through really quickly each one of the master plans and kind of give you a high-level overview. I think all of this should be similar to what you've seen before in past presentations, but we thought it was kind of a good opportunity to kind of see it all together in one big picture. So I'm going to start off and talk about the housing master plan. I will also cover parks, and then we'll have folks from the other master plans kind of sharing those, and I will also talk land use, I guess, too. So starting with the housing study. So the housing study really does focus on the policies and strategies related to achieving the mix of housing and price points that we need here in the future for the community. It provides a really good context for the units that we need to meet the demand that was identified in the land use plan. So what does the mix of those units look like? What are the price points we need to be reaching in that mix? And then really at the core of this is, how do we get there? What are the policies and strategies that help us get and address the housing needs that we both have currently today, but that we think we're going to continue to have into the future, or address maybe some of those needs we have today, so it's not as big of an issue into the future. Okay, I'm going to hand this off, I think, to Alan.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Alan Dennis. If we haven't met, I'm a Norman resident, live in Ward 4, so happy to be here with you guys today to talk about stormwater. Just very briefly, the big picture of stormwater in Norman is that we have two major watersheds. The Canadian River watershed is most of the south and west part of the city that drains kind of those really concentrated tributaries that go to the Canadian River. I may have messed that up, but the Canadian River watershed is most of the urbanized area of Norman. A lot of constrained flooding issues, a lot of old infrastructure that has, the repair and the maintenance of that is the big concern as far as cost there. Lake Thunderbird watershed obviously drains towards Lake Thunderbird, and it's most of this area that is proposed for future development in the north part of the city, as well as on the east of about 12th Avenue or Sooner Road. So the priorities in that watershed are maintaining those natural areas, maintaining that water quality as it drains to our primary drinking source of Lake Thunderbird. So some of the recommendations that were identified through the Stormwater Master Plan, continuing or to require runoff quality treatment in these new developments. So runoff water quality treatment is recommended in the 2009 Stormwater Master Plan. It's recommended in the 2023 engineering design criteria updates, but it's not required. So we recommend that that would be something that is required for new developments to treat that first flush of rainfall to capture some of those pollutants before it runs off into the detention ponds and the things that kind of maintain that flow downstream. Also continuing the water quality protection zone ordinance, maintaining that, and also continuing to monitor water quality at those total maximum daily load stations. We have those around Norman right now. Those are being funded. We recommend that a few additional be added to monitor that baseline condition to understand what's happening as development starts to go in. The WQPZ, the Water Quality Protection Zone, is something that was implemented in 2009. Well, recommended in 2009, implemented a few years later, and it is excellent. That water quality protection of maintaining that riparian zone is critical to maintaining those natural areas and that water quality in East Norman. We recommend that that be continued and even preserved. Like right now, you can reduce the size of those. We recommend that those be maintained at the current width that they are mapped within the 2045 reserve area, so that stream buffer is not reduced within that 2045 reserve area that Amy's going to talk about in a little bit. Creating incentive program for projects that exceed that stormwater management requirements. There are certain stormwater management requirements right now. If those developments or increased impervious area exceed the stormwater management requirements, we recommend that an incentive program be created. It goes into more detail in our stormwater master plan. And that also depends on funding. Stormwater utility fee funding can be tied to that incentive program so that those two can be married together, and it really gives a way for that funding to be or for that incentive to be implemented. Finally, well, not finally, but we do recommend updating the engineering design criteria. We have a recommended every 2 years to look at the science and look at the engineering standards for how that stormwater investment enrichment practices, what are the recommendations, how has that changed over the last 2 years, and then implement that into the engineering design criteria. And also, as accessory structures are permitted, specifically in the Canadian River watershed, where we already have a lot of problems, where any increased impervious area in the Canadian River is going to exacerbate our problems, we recommend that low impact development or LID practices be implemented and potentially even required once accessory structures are added. So those are our main recommendations. I think we're going to do questions at the end, but I'd love to talk to you guys more about that. But I'm going to pass it over to Mary Elizabeth to talk about water and wastewater.
Good evening, Council. Thank you for having us here. All right, I get to talk about water. So one of the key takeaways is when we're looking at water, we want to know how much, we want to make sure that we're going to have water security for the city of Norman for years to come. So we look at how much we need based off population, how much we are currently supplying, and that gap is what we need to then fill as far as determining how much more additional demand we need to go and outsource to fulfill and ensure that security. So as we looked at what it takes to fill that gap, we looked at a number of resources and ways to do that. You can see here on this graph, we looked at everything from how to expand the Canadian River alluvium to what we're currently doing with respect to additional wells, increasing the connection to Oklahoma City, which we buy finished water from them. And then finally, can we continue to augment like Thunderbird with some purified water via the water reclamation facility? So we look at not only the capital costs, but we also look at the operations and maintenance costs, and we put those together to determine a cost per thousand, which you will then see here on the graph, which is how many dollars it takes to produce 1,000 gallons of water, so that we can compare things across all the different scenarios that were provided. So as we can see that Oklahoma City wholesale, as well as new wells within the existing Garber-Wellington aquifer, and then finally the existing water reclamation facility with purified water was the three choices that showed to be the most cost-effective solutions. Now, when we talk about not just how we get the water, we need to make sure that we're getting it to the citizens, businesses, industry, et cetera, for the city. And so that's been done by the distribution network, the pipes that we have in the ground. We want to make sure that they're sized appropriately, as well as have sufficient materials so they're not going to have problems conveying that water to everybody. So there are several items that are noted here in this graph. which indicate where we need some additional ground storage tanks or pump stations, as well as some upsizing of some lines. And that also helps develop the priorities for the next 20 years for the Utilities Department with respect to distributing water. So next I get to talk about wastewater, my favorite thing. We talk about not only how we're going to provide water to the citizens, we have to then collect it and then treat it before we put it out in the environment. And the key takeaways were that the city of Norman evaluated the existing water reclamation facility and its ability to meet both current and future demands. So we looked at also a number of opportunities to collect that wastewater and also different areas throughout town where it could be treated. And after looking at, we've heard about a north side wastewater treatment facility, and then the existing one is down south of town on Jenkins Road. And after looking at where we could potentially treat that water at a variety of locations, it was ultimately determined that the existing wastewater reclamation facility with some large regional lift stations to convey it then to the existing site would be the most cost advantageous for the city. Similar to the distribution network that we talked about, being able to have the pipe sized correctly to collect that wastewater and then convey it to the water reclamation facility is very important. And so we also identified a number of lift stations and pipes in the ground that would need to be proposed over the next 20 years in order to accomplish that goal. And those have also been identified here on the map, and you can see those are numbered based on priorities and then also how they would be implemented as demand and growth dictates. So those are the key takeaways for water and wastewater. And next I'll pass it back to Amy for parks.
Mary Elizabeth, did you have?
Yes,
Yeah,
sir,
just
sorry.
real quick, can you go back to the previous slide real quick, I'm sorry. I wanted
Yes,
to
Councilor
ask
Peacock?
about that, the conceptual force main that's shown basically east of town and circle back in. As the reason it goes that far out east is basically to get around existing drainage. I see that big purple curve shape there, I'm assuming that's a,
Are you talking
Around
about
7A and 7B.
yeah, there's,
these here? Or
well, just the
oh,
four,
these down here.
just the sewer main that is the dashed green line.
Well, is that the force main? No, it's the gravity. It's to collect additional homes and it's a collection network that also follows the gravity line back to the plant the most to take advantage of the existing topography of the town.
Okay.
You're talking about the green line?
I'm talking about the green line.
Oh,
Yeah,
I'm
that
sorry,
would be
the
the-
green one.
So that'd be the force main.
Yeah.
I thought you said 77B. That's the force main, and so
Right.
it's the most direct path.
Okay, it's basically, it's going around drainage, is the reason why it has to go from 48th out to 72nd back and then,
We're picking up all of these lift stations, and so it'll be phased in. So these would then pick up from here to here, then here to here, and then this would be the biggest one that would then route it to here.
okay. I guess I'm trying to understand why we didn't just go straight south from the one on 48th, basically.
Well, I think ultimately it was the most direct path to also pick up that lift station down near 7A, 7B. So we want to have as few as lift stations as possible so that we are going to, it's better to have one large lift station than to have a number of smaller ones.
Right.
And so you could route it south, but then you're still kicking it back over in a more densely populated area that would then go through people's backyards and a variety of other conflicts with existing utilities.
Thank you.
And this is conceptual in nature.
Sure.
Yeah,
That's why I
master
was-
plans are conceptual. so.
Absolutely.
So how far east are you planning on? Is sewer projected to push out?
Pardon me?
How far east is sewer projected to push out?
You can see that this goes out to east of 60th. That's where that green line for the force main goes.
Just shy of 72nd?
It doesn't quite meet 72nd. And again, this is conceptual. Nathan, Chris, did you have any?
No, very conceptual. We'll be looking for someone willing to sell if and when you get to that point, so it moves.
The one on the south too, you just have the two drainage basins, and we wanted to be at that spot there rather than Mary saying, like, we don't want to have two lift stations, one on the North Creek and one on the South Arm. By having it at the confluence, we're able to just have the one.
Right.
we'll move on to the next one, so we make use of best time.
Well, great. Parks. Everybody loves parks, right? So this one's pretty easy. I believe even Parks went to Parks Board earlier this month. But as part of this process, there was the opportunity, they updated the mission statement for this, so you can see that up there, created a whole new kind of branding and logo. But they also identified what were some of the key community priorities. And those started with, prioritizing some of the outstanding goals. So what were some of those things from the previous 2009 plan that we still we're working on or hadn't quite accomplished yet? Creating a comprehensive trail network. I will say probably pretty consistently throughout all of the public engagement, trails and the trail network was a common theme that reoccurred over and over again. So that kind of rose to the top in the park planning process too. Prioritizing effective stormwater management and protecting Lake Thunderbird, and how can we all incorporate that also into kind of our park and rec and open space opportunities. Making sure that we're supporting and elevating arts and cultural aspects of Norman. That's a pretty unique aspect to your park and rec department here in Norman, but it's also a really exciting one because it takes this big kind of fuller picture of what we view as quality of life. So it's really exciting to see that incorporated in here too. Updating and modernizing policies that support the work of funding and developing and maintaining our park and rec system. And then finally, just making sure we're maintaining a well-rounded and a diverse array of programming in the community. So that was also closely looked at of what's the programming we have today and what potentially do we see in the future, which is always a struggle to guess. Because I'm guessing that when James started his career, he wouldn't have picked pickleball to be the big thing that was hitting in 2025. I don't know, maybe he had vision that I had.
I would say cornhole.
Transportation, Brett, do you wanna?
Thank you. Brett Cavins with Gardner. I'm a 38-year resident of Norman. That's a long time, and Ward 5 resident currently. So talk a little bit about transportation. We were here back in February, the end of February, and gave a pretty lengthy presentation on the comprehensive transportation plan update. And basically, this is an update to the 2014 comprehensive transportation plan. It's not new, it's an update. Now, one thing it did do though, it did take a little deeper dive into aviation, parking and transit to include it in this transportation plan. But we still took the guiding principles from the 2014 plan and projected them forward with this update. The biggest thing when we went out and talked to the public was probably active transportation, trails and sidewalks, and connecting to parks as well. And so what you see here is really a new backbone, major investment in active transportation that encompasses the entire city. And basically, if you want to get on a bike in Northwest Norman and you want to go all the way out to the lake on your bike, you're going to be able to do that with this plan. Now you see there are very specific nodes, and those are generators of industry or schools or connection points to other communities through this. But that's kind of how what we want to set this up in parks, obviously connections to those kind of things as well, is how somebody can actively on a bike, walk, get to other parts of town without using transit, without using a vehicle. I think that was one of the biggest things and one of the most proud accomplishments of the subcommittee's work that they did on this project. Next, we updated the roadway plan, and as you know, over the past 20 years, things have changed in our community through here. But we wanted to make sure that we were consistent with other studies. You see the ACOG 2045 plan, and we'll touch on that in just a second a little bit more. But we also looked at the ODOT 8-year program. You do notice the turnpikes are referenced only for reference only. This transportation plan does not focus on OTA. It focuses on Norman and what our needs are going to be as we continue to grow as a community through here. But we did update these existing facilities, and some of them changed a little bit. And One that you will see is 48th Avenue East, and what we think that is going to become more of a north-south corridor for East Norman. We focused on safety. A lot of the improvements that we say when we say widening, and I have a slide that kind of explains that a little bit better, focus on safety throughout the entire plan. When we talk about roadway improvements, widening takes on a really large concept here. It could be anything from adding shoulders to an existing two-lane roadway, and that then updates that from a potential collector road to more of a principal arterial, let's say. Just doesn't have to be that we're gonna pave the world and put four-lane highways out through anywhere. Adding sidewalks, adding side paths, those things are what we're calling for with roadway improvements. And then protection for left turn lanes. 36th, or excuse me, East Alameda is a great example where we have a third lane right now, just west of 36. And everybody kind of questioned, well, why do we do that? There's no development through there. But look out there now, signs for development are going through there right now. So we try to plan a little bit in for the future. Improving rural intersection safety. One of the other things that we did with the master plan update was we provided staff with a tool to look at intersection improvements and considered a typical signalized intersection with a roundabout, and how we then identify the criteria and how we score and rank those. Some intersection improvements may warrant a roundabout, some may not warrant a roundabout, and the typical traffic signal will work there as well. And then obviously we want to protect the pedestrians and the bikers as we go through here. It's, you know, as you see this special corridor, we talked about this earlier, Alameda is one of the other big things the subcommittee put together was a special corridor for East Alameda. I'm gonna back up one slide and show you this. If somebody were to get on a bike or walk from downtown Norman and want to go all the way out to the lake, they really don't have that ability to do it right now. The special corridor, as we've got conceptually laid out here, is improving the roadway, adding shoulders for vehicular safety, adding a median for vehicular safety as well, and then looking at adding trails on both sides. And that, therefore, you've addressed safety for pedestrians, you could address safety for the bicyclist, and you also address safety for the vehicular people going forward. And then we did come up with a list of projects. They're in no certain order, or really, this is kind of how the rankings fell out based on the subcommittee's criteria. Between project priorities, high, low, medium, what the state is going to be focusing on. You see 12th Avenue or Highway 77, they'll have that focus. But another thing that we want to look at is really what are some of the projects that are going to be coming forward. We talked a little bit about 48th Avenue East being that major north-south corridor for East Norman. We also want to look at an east-west corridor along Franklin Road, not only for vehicular transportation, but also active transportation. If you looked at our previous map there, that's a very important corridor for us. We talked a little bit about the special corridor for East Alameda for all users, and again, that's safety driven for pedestrians and vehiculars. And then one of the new roundabouts, we tested our new criteria spreadsheet on the roundabout at Franklin and Porter. If you kind of know that area, and it has that odd little skew going up Broadway to Moore, that scored very well with the roundabout. And so these are some of the projects that we highlighted with our transportation master plan update. Amy?
Greg, there's
Sorry.
a sidewalk or multimodal path, I'll learn the right term finally. A multimodal path that goes along New Nine. And it goes, I don't think we're to the hundreds yet, have
No,
you hit
you're not.
108? And so are you gonna duplicate that up on Old Nine, which is Alameda?
Yes.
Okay,
On both sides of the road,
10 feet wide?
12 feet wide.
12 feet? Good golly, okay,
12 feet's the new standard.
thank you, sir.
Real quick, I know this is getting in the weeds. Do you happen to know like what the statutory right of way is in Alameda? Is there 100 feet or would we have to take easement?
There's 33 feet each side right now,
Okay.
and in some sections, we already have that additional 17 feet on each side.
Okay.
So the overall right-of-way footprint is gonna be the standard 100-foot right-of-way, which is the city standard right now.
Thank you.
Questions? Thanks.
Okay, great. So we wanted to start off with the land use, just kind of addressing a couple of questions that maybe have arisen over the last few weeks, starting with the population projection and just giving a little bit of background around that. So there's lots of different methodologies that you can use to determine what a community's future population is going to be. We actually used two different approaches and presented those to the committee, pretty standard approaches in planning practice, and actually provided the committee with a range from a low to a high number. Excuse me. And the committee actually spent a couple meetings talking about those and discussing it, and chose then the scenario that we used throughout the rest of the planning process through that effort. So just wanted to provide a little bit of that background. Also just, I think we've talked about this before, but as a little bit of a reminder, we did have a really great land use group. I don't think I've ever worked with a project that has had our committee and residents as involved and as knowledgeable in the land use planning process as we had here. So that was greatly appreciated. The group met several or more times, spent over 15 hours kind of working through as a group, meeting and working through with a lot of detailed conversations and even getting down kind of parcel by parcel. So, and as part of that, we spent a lot of time talking about the 2045 and the urban reserve areas, both in that working group and as part of the larger steering committee. They spent probably 3+ meetings with that, looking through multiple map revisions and versions, looking at the options for the natural boundary, which we spent several meetings discussing. And then finally, ultimately, kind of them coming to the conclusion that really the policies that we needed to have in place that would protect the lake and land determined more important was protecting the land and the lake and the wildlife and all of those things was ultimately more important than where the line ultimately kind of landed. And then finally, ultimately, the plans were unanimously recommended from the steering committee. So again, a big thank you and a big shout out to all the members that participated in that and gave their time and gave their talents in that effort. Presented this, I think, a couple times already to you, but just as a little bit of a reminder, this is a different approach than what you have in your existing plan of how we're addressing land use planning here. It's much more kind of with the idea of how do we create more flexibility? How do we have more mixing of uses, which is something that we've heard a lot from folks. How do we get away from kind of siloing things and create more vibrant communities based on kind of intensity of the uses? So a few things that were taken into consideration with the development of the land use is compatibility. How are things compatible? And this often goes back a little bit to the intensity piece. What's the relationship between those and how can we lessen when we have compatibility issues? Mention the mixing of uses. This was something that we heard a lot through community engagement. How can we have more opportunities to live, work, and play and kind of within our neighborhoods? That intensity, does the intensity match? And so that you can have a commercial use that potentially has the same intensity as a residential use and allowing those to work together. And then finally, density, which actually fits in usually pretty closely with the intensity piece. We started talking about this a little bit as a three-legged stool as we moved forward, where we have our character areas, which is all about how the built environment kind of begins to fit together. This piece, the character area map, is not something that will change. Any changes to that would occur with a bigger full update of this planning process. Then you have the land use map and the land use plan, and the land use is where we're kind of drilling down and getting more specific with each one of these kind of legs of the stool. And it's where we see how the built environment starts to kind of develop. And there could potentially be some amendments to the land use plan. But really with the change in approach, you probably are going to see fewer land use amendments coming before you because of that kind of intensity approach that we're trying to take here and kind of moving away from the siloing. And then finally, we have the zoning and subdivision ordinance. And this is where the regulations are required to enforce our policies and recommendations of the plan on a site-specific level. So we're drilling down to an even more specific level. And that, again, you are going to continue to see rezonings because as projects come forward, they might match the land use that we're showing on the land use map, but they might need a rezoning. And that's the activity and the piece that you have in front of you is what we're going to get to here tonight to kind of illustrate how that all works. A little bit of background on the character area maps. The character area map, we identified 7 character areas. We actually started out with more of those and realized that we had a lot of things that were overlapping and duplicating, and so kind of came to, it really started to make sense to merge some of those together, and we narrowed it down to 7 land use character areas, and this is then ultimately the map that you see before you. Then we have the land use section, and again, the land use is how we see the built environment. We kind of you can kind of start to lump some of the land use categories together into kind of our reserve and rural categories, more of our urban neighborhoods, and then more of our kind of mixed use and employment centers. The mixed use and employment centers, I would describe those as being a little bit, a lot of times you can have residential in those areas, but they're going to lead more with a commercial or a job base. And our neighborhood areas are you can have some commercial in those areas, but I describe it as they're going to lead more with residential. So that residential is going to be stronger in there. And then we have kind of our other categories of civic and some of our open spaces. And again, the land use map that we ultimately came to. As we moved into the implementation section and looking at how all of these pieces began to fit together, we started to put together some tools that illustrated how the different intensities began to overlap and where land uses were on kind of that intensity range from the least intense to the most intense. And then if we have compatibility issues, where we might see those, and then that feeds into how we begin to mitigate some of those compatibility issues. For each of the land use categories, and I really think this is an important part of any comprehensive plan because it begins to really explain what each one of the land use categories are. And we kind of did that explanation. It's a kind of a 1-page definition or 2-page definition for each of the land uses. And it's described and it's defined by building type. So what types of buildings are appropriate within this land use, site design, transportation and network, circulation, access. What are the important aspects of those? So we're going to have land uses where we're going to say this is more appropriate along a higher intensity street because it's a higher intensity use, as opposed to a lower intensity use, which might be more appropriate along a local street. We're going to have utility access and how that maybe will need to be dealt with. Public spaces, the types of public spaces that we would like to see in these land use areas and what's appropriate for them. Locational criteria, so where is it appropriate where are these uses appropriate and where maybe they aren't, and therefore some of the things that we might need to mitigate. And then some of the common zoning districts that we have today that will be applicable, and that might be getting adjusted a little bit as we move forward with some zoning changes. Want to spend a little bit of time talking about the reserve areas because the committee I'll spend a little bit of time on it, but the committee spent a lot of time talking about the reserve areas and working through those areas. Really the intent here is how do we preserve and protect these areas for the future? We don't see development occurring in these areas during the life of this plan, but that doesn't mean we don't know that that could never happen. We're not going to make that assumption. So therefore, we want to look at ways that we can preserve and protect. We also realize that, you know, in a month from now, in a year from now, somebody may walk in the door to the planning department and say, I want to do something with my property, and the city needs to have the tools in place for how they're going to address that. So that's really we have the 2045 reserve, which is the character area. These are the policies that guide the preservation for future urban densities and protection of wildlife habitat and water resources. So the water resources especially was something, rural character and the water resources, and making sure we have the policies in this character area that protect those two pieces were high priorities for our committee and for the residents. The urban reserve is the land use designation then, so we're getting down more specific here, right? And it describes how development should be designed if it occurs. So it goes back to, we aren't assuming that anything in this area needs to develop in the next 20 years, but that doesn't mean in a year from now, somebody isn't going to walk in the door and say, I want to do something, and the city needs guidance on how to address that. I'm going to pass this off now because we're going to move into a little bit of the implementation and how you get to use your plan.
Hi, Laura Hoggett and Destiny Andrews. All right, so we'll just go through a couple of scenarios of what you'll see coming forward in staff reports. So first things first, we have some ordinance amendments coming forward. They're primarily for our zoning ordinance and our subdivision regulations. It's kind of to clean up any references that were to our Norman 2025 plan. And then one kind of big one is to require a minimum of 30 acres when you're doing a certificate of survey in the 2045 reserve character area. So right now the minimum is 10. So for this area specifically, it'll go up to 30. Anything east of that will stay the 10-acre minimum. Okay, so we'll go through some of our scenarios. We have one example of how the policies in the plan could direct support, and then we had one example where it could direct denial of rezoning and plan amendment. So these are the maps are very rudimentary, if you will. We didn't pick any exact location in the city because we didn't want it to seem like we were rezoning or picking apart someone's property. But they are scenarios that could happen on the map, but it's not a specific lot. It's just, sorry, slow down.
No, sit down so they can see the
Sit
screen.
Thank you. Yeah. I thought you were telling me to slow down, and I was like, where do we have so much? Okay. Sorry. Okay, so here's the first request. This is rezoning only, so the land use plan would allow for this. The land use is all urban medium for the subject tract and the surrounding area, and then it is currently zoned R1, and they would be requesting RM6. So our staff reports moving forward, zoning and land use will be in the same report, so you won't have to read two different reports. One of our amendments is in the zoning to allow the land use plan to be a factor, one of many factors when considering a rezoning. So it helps tie them together a little more.
And so looking at the staff reports in front of you, they're kind of separated out into a couple of different sections. The first section will provide the existing conditions for the property and the surrounding properties. The second section will be extremely familiar. That's procedural requirements. So that's any other meetings that it had to go to before it gets to your tables. The summary of application will be just straight facts of the case. So what is happening, and so you can see kind of that same explanation. They're constructing, or they'd like to construct 14 dwelling units to the acre for a multi-unit project. So that's that RM6 standard. Moving forward, you would see a short section called review comments. That acts as a key, kind of, or a legend for the entire staff analysis section. So that'll give you a little heads up when you're looking at it. And then it moves into comments by department agency. And so that's kind of where the meat of the actual reports are going to be. And it will take into account for the planning side, both zoning considerations and comp plan considerations, as Laura said. So to be determined as a part of your decision, one of many factors. And you can see kind of on this slide here, zoning considerations. So the district, the uses permitted, that's all of the stuff that you would typically see. And then we're adding in the comp plan considerations, which would be those policies under the land use designations, the character areas, as well as if there's any special study or special reserve area associated with the plan. So specifically in this project, you can kind of see we've highlighted in blue and in italics what would be going forward staff comments. And so they might change a little bit before you actually see it before you. It might not be blue at that point, but this is kind of where we're headed. And so you can see almost a call and response under that zoning code consideration. So on page 5, if you're looking at zoning code considerations, it lays out the purpose of that zoning code and you can, or of that zoning district, and you can see that the RM6 district is designed to encourage the developing of neighborhoods with a variety of housing types. And so that's kind of how that ties in, and then you would see the staff response. The application includes what type of housing units, and for this one specifically, it's apartment style multi-unit buildings. Moving a little bit forward to page 7, you'll see kind of the same idea, but now we've started looking again at those character area policies, and then moving farther along into pages 8 and 9, you'll see the land use policies. So specifically in this project, we're looking at 2 to 3 story buildings are being proposed, there's parking in the rear, and that's where this type of information would be assessed by staff and would be provided to you whether or not it is consistent or inconsistent with the plan. Do you want to?
Okay. So for this specific example, if you go to page 9, you'll see where we outline these details, under building types, these details are consistent with the building type guidelines. So we will try to point out when they are or are not, as Destiny said. And then you'll see kind of the same alternatives and issues, so any impacts that all the departments have shared with us, and then our regular conclusion. So for this example, because it meets building types, height, all the utilities, things like that, the plan would help direct support of this application. Do you have any questions about this one, or do you want us to move on to the next?
Just one quick question.
Yes.
So, I'm just thinking about uses permitted. So as it aligns with the new plan, would you enter a SPUD when they want uses that aren't a part of that area?
Mm-hmm.
So let's say they want a bodega with this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so then they would have to do a SPUD or a PUD depending on the acreage that they have.
Okay, I just wanted clarity. Thank you.
Yeah. And then when we get our new zoning ordinance, we'll kind of do something like this again to bring you up to speed and show how it'll all work together then. So our second example is in the urban reserve area. So the current zoning is A2, they would be requesting a PUD to go down to 1 acre lots. So this would be bringing urban low land use into the urban reserve area. So the reports are set up much the same, but there is an added section for the land use amendment because they would have to request a land use change.
Yeah, and so this section is on page 7 of that second staff report. And you can see that we've integrated the matrix that you saw earlier in the presentation that talks about how the uses are compatible with one another or not. And then the table below that would show the surrounding properties kind of more in detail. A score of 5 is the most appropriate. So here going from an urban reserve to an urban reserve to an urban low is consistent with some of the surrounding areas. But again, you'll note that in this project specifically, as Laura said, the proposed project includes 1 acre lots, which is not consistent with the 2045 reserve. And so again, the 2045 reserve, which we are taking into account with land use changes, requires that the development be contiguous to existing development. And so in this project, it's not contiguous, which means that it's not adjoining a land use that is already been developed. It is not connecting to services without a huge needed of an unplanned improvement extension. And it is resulting in unplatted or undeveloped parcels in between things. You also have to demonstrate that you meet the implementation of all of the other policies in the 2045 reserve character area. And so that includes PUDs only being utilized when 65% or more of the land is reserved in future outlots or reserved in an outlot for future urban densities. And what this would specifically look like on this project would require lots only down to 2 acres on that remaining 35%. And what we mean again when we talk about preserving in an outlot is that 65% of the total land area, so you can see that this application on the front here is 45 acres. So 65% of that 45 acres would have to be held for future urban densities. And that's a little bit different from coverage. So you can see we've preserved that 65%, and then on each lot, there's a maximum amount of coverage that would be allowed, and that would be your impervious surfaces.
So in this example, because they're requesting 1 acre lots, that is not consistent with our urban reserve area, so the plan would direct denial of this application. So the smallest acreage you can go down to in the urban reserve is 2 acres. And that would always have to come before council as a rezoning. Yes.
I just want to drill down on an important thing you just said. I think that if it doesn't meet the urban reserve, it'll get a recommendation to decline from staff.
We won't necessarily be doing recommendations unless that changes, but it will say that it's not consistent with the plan, which do what that is.
It won't say recommends for approval necessarily.
Right.
Thank you. That's what-
Yes.
But that's why they're requesting the land use change, right?
Well, they would have to because it doesn't meet it, but council can turn it down with support from the plan because it doesn't meet the outlined policies.
But if it changed, then it would be consistent with land use of that particular type that it changed to.
What do you mean if it changed?
Like if it gets approved to change, these are all valid reasons to reject the project under the present land use, but they're not requesting to do it under the present land use. They're requesting to change it to one that they can do it under.
Yes, but you could deny that and have a basis for it within the plan instead of just saying no for, what are the words, arbitrary and capricious reasons.
So why would we be rejecting the request to change the land use designation?
Because it doesn't meet the,
Any project that occurs within the 2045 character area is subject to an additional point of review. So if they were not in the 2045 reserve area, you would see on page 8 of this report that there's an entire section here, 2045 reserve character area policies, that it then has a response on page 9 where it says the proposed project is not contiguous to existing development and does not meet the 65% minimum. And so that would not be in every land use application that you get. That is only in this land use application because the subject property is within that 2045 reserve area.
But they're not requesting to do the project in that area. They're trying to do it in the area they're changing it to.
They're requesting to do it in the 2045 character area, although they are requesting to remove themselves from the urban reserve land use.
So what would be the basis of rejecting the change of the land use?
The character area policies, which are part of the comprehensive land use plan and is laid out in the implementation section as that additional point of review.
Well, if it conformed with the land use, they wouldn't be requesting a change, would they?
I'm not sure I'm understanding your question.
If their request was consistent with the land use plan, they wouldn't be requesting the change,
They would be requesting a rezoning.
just the rezoning. Right.
I'm not following, I guess. It's kind of like now if you're requesting a commercial and a residential land use, you still have to go to council to request the change.
So what would be the basis of denying?
I just wanted to add something to that. as Destiny says, the 2045 is a character area, and they're requesting a land use change. Those are two different mechanisms. Individuals can request a land use change, but they cannot individually request a character area amendment. An amendment to the character area section would be a council or city initiated thing that actually is an amendment to the plan as a whole. And that's why those factors are going to keep popping up every time a land use change is requested within that character area.
So does that give you a legal reason to reject it?
The way the plan is set up, yes, the factors are literally based on those two criteria that will be coming anytime something in that character area is brought for a land use change.
Okay, so does this make it more difficult for individuals who say, I want to divide their parcel so their parents can live next door?
If it's less than 30 acres in this area, yes. Which is kind of the downside, but that's what we heard from the committee, is that they wanted to make this area kind of the final frontier of development in Norman, so we don't keep going further and further east.
Any further questions or comments? Well, thank you very much for an absolutely wonderful piece of work. It really is amazing how much you guys have put into this.
And so we have some members of the committee here, if you guys have any questions about the committee, or if you have questions about any of the plans.
The population growth?
Yep.
It was mentioned that there were two models presented to the committee to consider. What were those two models?
The first model was one based on an annual growth rate that looked at historic trends with regards to the annual growth rate, which is a pretty standard methodology for projecting future population. The other methodology was one that we frequently use in university cities, where we remove the student population because often the student population is staying pretty consistent. Now, in this case, OU has shared, I think, publicly that they're working to grow. But in this methodology, you would remove the student population, apply the annual growth rate to what we call the permanent population, and then you add the student population back in. So we showed both of those methodologies here in this, and you can kind of see that it's maybe a little bit small with the committee. And so we ended up with a range when we did this from anywhere from 100 for a 2045 population projection of 147,000, I'm gonna round off, to a number of up to 185,000 in population projection. So we gave them a pretty good range and talked through each one of those scenarios, I think in at least 2 meetings. And the conclusion that the committee came to was they wanted to base the planning process on that 185,000.
Marilyn?
On the population part too, so there's always a discussion about what is the city of Norman's population and does it include students or not? And my response always is that most students probably, if they fill out the census data or if their parents do, they fill it out from their hometown. But there are students that fill out the census data and identify Norman as their
That's the way they're supposed to.
year-round residents. So if we're just taking out the number of total students at OU, is that really an accurate reflection if many of them do live in Norman all year round?
Yeah, I guess to get into the weeds, we don't usually take out the full student body population because one, we assume that probably our part-time students are more kind of permanent residents here. We also like to assume that we hope some students will stay after and want to make Norman their home, right? So we do calculate a certain percentage that we take out. I think that the ultimate thing, though, that we have to remember at the end of the day is whatever population we project, that isn't going to mean that it isn't going to direct development. It isn't going to. It's really the policies and strategies and ordinances that come out of this that will ultimately determine what development looks like and where that occurs.
So the 2020 census says we have 128,000 people. So to me, that says there's 128,000 census responses that say that they live in Norman all year round.
Right.
And so I assume that when school's in, that means there's several thousand students that did not claim Norman as their residence. So when school's in, there's more than 128,000 people living in Norman.
Potentially.
Is how I,
Especially because of when the census occurred in 2020.
yeah.
And how that potentially influenced where students were at that point.
And to Councilmember Holman's point, when they're all here together. And we provide them sewer and water and roads and parks and housing and all of those elements. They, even if it's not 12 months, if it's only 8 months or 9 months, when they're here, they're using all of the infrastructure that the city has available. So it does make sense that your student population is in there, because when they're here, we're providing them all the same services as our residents permanent.
Okay, thanks.
Your 2025 population,
So where did that number come from?
yes.
It's based off of the 2020 and the scenarios that we developed. So even if you go to the census today, it does not have a 2025 estimated population. It has a 2023 estimated population. So, I mean, we could potentially go back and look at what they're estimating for 2023, but we work off of the base year of 2020 and then project out from there.
So the end of 2024 is about 130,000. 137,000 is about the estimated 2025 population in the 2025 comprehensive plan.
So can I ask where that 2024 number came from?
That's the last year that we've completed.
But the census's number is 2023.
When was the last time you checked?
And they voted in 20.
The census releases usually their estimated numbers in December, and I actually checked last week. And the American Community Survey does a 1 year and a 5 year estimate, and it's a 2023 5 year and a 2023 1 year.
So how
From the
far
US.
off is that from 137, nearly 138,000?
The 2023 estimate, it's actually pretty I don't remember the exact numbers, but it's actually pretty interesting, because their 1 year estimate, which we tend to use the 5 year estimate, but there was actually a pretty big difference even between their 1 year and their 5 year estimate. I think there was like a 5,000, I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, but there was a pretty significant difference between even their 1 and their 5 year estimate.
So, of course, the benefit of dividing the student population and the permanent resident population is to see if there's a significantly different growth function, right?
Well,
Because if the functions are the same, putting them together, keeping them together is fine. You can fit a model to it, it's more or less the average. If they're a different function, if one's exponential while the other is linear, then that becomes useful to divide out and to keep those two models separate. But what kind of function did you find when you divided them out?
So when we take, one of the things that we pointed out to the committee is that as Norman has grown, it's grown faster than the student population. So the student population is only making up about 16% of the population. So when we work in university cities, I mean, I'll give you an example of like Bloomington, Indiana, where the student population is 40 to almost 50% of the total population. It's really important for us to take that factor in, because we know those students aren't going to stay there and add babies to the population. They're not gonna marry and have children and add to the population in the future. So we know that we cannot be kind of compounding or adding to their base. So we're gonna remove those. It's a little bit different as we get to a city the size of Norman, where now the student population is only making up about 16% of the total population. So that's part of the reason that we kind of talked through with the committee about, does it make sense to leave them in or take them out?
Yeah, it's perfectly fine to leave them in this case. What kind of function did you find?
When we,
What kind of function
I'd
for
have to go back.
population growth?
For the student population growth,
Logic, exponential, linear?
what, like, was it a linear? No, we looked at an annual growth rate as it related to the students too.
Did you find there to be a linear correlation or an exponential?
I don't remember, I'd have to go back and look through the material again. Sorry, I didn't go into that level of researching this.
Were those options presented to the committee?
These were the options that were presented to
Just
the
a
committee.
percentage, so assuming the exponential growth curve.
Yes, because that's a pretty standard practice.
But is that accurate?
You know, when we went back and looked at a linear, we're only talking less than 10,000 people in the kind of difference between a linear and an annual growth rate. We're talking a few thousand people either way. We looked at it in multiple ways of how we could do this, and when you're going between potentially being at 770,000, we're somewhere between plus or minus 180,000.
It's about a 25,000 population difference.
Between the low and the high here, or between the linear.
Between linear and exponential.
I'd have to go back and look at the linear again. I didn't remember it being that big of a difference.
The 2025 comprehensive plan was only off by about 20%. Yeah, they looked at the data, they looked at the historical trends. 20% or so, maybe like 18%.
I mean, I guess at the end of the day, we can stand here and argue about methodology all day, but ultimately, we gave a low and a high to the committee. They chose to go with the higher rate, and ultimately, the rate, the number that's selected isn't going to say that's it's not going to change the decision of anybody of what they're going to do with their property, and it's not probably going to change the decision of what the developer wants to do with their property.
It has an effect on every bit of the narrative, the basis of the plan. And if you didn't even look at the historical data.
We looked at
and
historical data,
Did you
and we
present
looked at
it?
the annual growth rate.
But you didn't
That's
present that to
standard
the committee.
present. We did not look, yes, we presented we looked at annual growth rate and we presented that to the committee.
So you presented them an exponential growth rate and said to choose an exponential growth model.
I would also point out that we did acknowledge and talked through the fact that that exponential growth rate has been slowing. So it was you have decades where you've been growing at more than 1.5% annual growth rate.
When you have a variance in your exponential growth rate, that makes it, and it deviates exponentially. Has Norman grown at an exponential growth rate?
Councilmember, perhaps we can adjourn and you can talk math and do those kinds of things. That for most of us, these explanations, I assume, are perfectly good.
I mean, the fact remains that we've had an incredibly linear growth model going back to 1940.
Okay.
Somehow, now we're projected to grow exponentially.
You could look at the growth rate.
We can look at the numbers and the facts all day long, but we're arguing the narrative at this point?
We also don't have a crystal.
No, but we do have math and we do have data, and we can look at those two instead of trying to choose a growth rate by committee and committing the committee to making a choice based on numbers, not by facts, or by numbers presented to them, generated from, I don't know where. I don't know where you got the 1.25% growth rate, and I don't know if you showed them how well that fit historical trends.
Yeah, and we can talk more about the 1.25%, where that came from.
So,
Yes, well, I'm gonna go on the record, I'm very comfortable with this. I actually sat through these meetings and listened to the committee go back and forth. And I'm not gonna get into the weeds of it, but just, for curiosity's sake, what happens if we're a little over, and what does that mean for our plan?
It really doesn't change anything, because ultimately, development happens when somebody walks into the door of the planning department and says, I want to do something with my parcel. We could have another recession. We could have another pandemic. There's a lot of things that could ultimately impact this projection being much slower or much faster than we have today. But ultimately, at the end of the day, all of you need the tools to say, what do we want to do when somebody walks in the door, and what do we want that development to look like, and where do we think it should occur first? in the planning process.
Well, I'm really comfortable. I know we put co-chairs at the head of this for wards 5 and 6. Ward 5 had 3 people on the committee and one saw himself out, so nothing to do there. I'm grateful for your explanations, and I'm happy to turn over to Stephen.
Councilmember Holmes?
Looking at the population data, I don't want to spend too much time on it, but just in that 2023 estimate from 2020 was a 1.6% growth rate. From 2020 compared to 2010, we had a 15.5% growth rate. 2000 to 2010, we had a 15.9. In 1990 to 2000, we had a 19.5%, 17.7 prior decade. All the way going back to 1950, we had a 136.3% growth rate in 1950 compared to 1940. But based on my rough calculation, in the last 25 years, we've grown by 26.9% of our total population that we have today. I may be off on that, but we've grown by 35,000 people in the last 25 years. So my main concern would be if we weren't prepared for more population growth than we're anticipating, more so than thinking we might have more than we do and then it not happening.
Is it linear or exponential?
Doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. We beat that horse to death.
Yes, sir.
I was just gonna ask, is it a fair statement to say that if we hit this population growth in 20 years or 40 years or 60 years, we still have the same issues, we still need to plan for it today? If we wanna offset development pressure on the east, we need to incentivize it in the core. And this plan really sets us up to do that. Totally understand where you're coming from, Councilman Nash. I really
Well, I'm
do.
not saying that we shouldn't be erring on the side of caution, but there's a certain point where when we're designing into the urban reserve area a pathway to development just in case, that just in case scenario exists because of this overestimation of future growth. And what we can do is we can approve appropriate land use change requests, but we can't roll back a plan that's too inviting. One of these routes is irreversible. We can be more reserved on how we structure this and change it if the situation dictates that need. But if we assume a situation that doesn't come to pass, well, we can't change that. Then we're opening up for things that we can't prevent because we can't roll it back. The only person at that point that can change can request the change of the land use or the zoning is the property owner. And if the property owners or if the land use has been given to open or lenient of a policy or a characteristic, because our estimation is that we're gonna have this extreme growth, a growth that by the last, what was the last 10 or 12 years of homes being built, like 792 per year? Is that what was in the comprehensive plan? If we accept the linear pattern, we're doing fine. If we accept an exponential that doubles the population from the linear growth, well, now the narrative goes to we need 1,100 a year. From our policies are fine, we should adjust to what the situation, what the future dictates, to let's anticipate the future and make this more inviting for, let's push growth when it doesn't need to be pushed. Let's open it up to building housing when we don't need that much housing. And these are all narrative effects that if we're going to be wrong, it's good to overestimate so that we're prepared without our pants down. But when we get to a certain point of being too wrong, well, now we're inviting too much. We're too lenient in the language. We're too lenient on the policies, and we can't take that back.
Well, our projections, it's not like an engineering math problem that you're putting a spaceship in the sky and you have to be exact. We have the ability to be able to correct along the way. if something else is there, more like a wire guided thing than it is loose by itself. And so if you're correct in your estimations of population or some tragedy or catastrophe hits us or something else like that, as human beings, we can stop back and we can say, I don't care about the math, what we need to do is, and we can do that from that point. It's cast in stone to a bit, but it's a soft stone, it's not a.
And if that were to happen, then projects that were appropriate to address those needs would come in front of the council, and the council would recognize that situation and could approve those projects because they're appropriate.
I would say.
And so if we're more reserved, there's less consequence than if we're too lenient.
Yeah, but that assumes the idea that people are gonna build to the plant. It was like the question on the 1,100 houses per year. We have to build 1,100 houses per year. No, we don't.
Don't
We have a
weaponize that plan.
demand for, and do we really have that? And who's gonna be the guy that determines that? The guy that's building those units, because he's the one that's going to the bank, he's the one that's taking the risk. He's the one that's doing all the rest of this stuff that has to develop the thing. All our problem is to make sure, Councilmember Holman and I had a discussion about Galveston. When Galveston grew so quickly, all of a sudden in the 90s and early 2000s, they didn't have enough infrastructure to keep up with their growth. They goofed it up, and they mismatched the growth by underestimating it. And now they were tearing everything up and putting stuff back down again. And it caused just nothing but confusion. So to actually overestimate and have more capacity than what we need is a benign problem. It's better to have a 6-inch main that's only got 4 inches of water in it than it is trying to force 8 inches through a 6-inch main, which you can't do.
And I'm not arguing that erring on the side of caution isn't a proper approach.
Yeah.
But there's an extent that starts to become detrimental.
There is.
Like when we work into the policy, an invitation to develop an urban reserve, and infrastructure is a barrier, but not really a barrier because our sewage is projected to be pushed out to almost 72nd. And besides that, any developer that wanted to push infrastructure that we don't have out there can work out with the city a way to pay for it, and then that's no longer a problem.
And this looks like an attempt to me, and it is not an attempt. This is a methodology to prevent town from bleeding into country. We want to protect that country. That's that character area is for. It's to make sure that city doesn't come out and get in the way of country living. It's a way to be able to hold that line for at least 25 years.
Kind of looks like a way to make sure that people can't divide their parcels to 10 acres for their, say, kids or their, like, even to pass down to their children as part of their will, and to keep them as large contiguous parcels so that when it is opened up to lots of development, developers will have large contiguous properties to choose from.
You can make that narrative. Yes, ma'am.
Just for thinking in the future, about how often has council come back and reviewed the previous plan, and like what would be the expectation of reviewing this plan and making adjustments in the future?
Jane could speak to the past reviews, but we are going to do an annual review of this one moving forward, and especially when there's new census data, ACS data.
Just a tweak.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, glad to hear it. So there is a pathway forward if numbers change and circumstances
And
evolve.
Historically,
to Councilmember Grant's point, when council said comprehensive, and we went all in on comprehensive, all 2,400 pages of it, it's printed out in its glory, recognizing that each one of those plans will have a slightly different absorption or adherence rate by what's going on out there in the real world. We would envision that 10 years, 15 years, 20 years from now, we don't bring you back another request to do them all at the same time. One of them will present itself as this one needs attention sooner than the rest, and we'll be able to budget for it out of the, you know, without having to bite off $1.5 million worth of resource to be able to do them in smaller chunks, but ensure their consistency throughout the whole document.
You know, in interest of our next meeting, I'm gonna adjourn this meeting so that we can get refreshed and